Welcome, everyone. Glad to see an attentive group here this afternoon. I'm Bob Allison, president of the Colonial Society of Massachusetts, which is a scholarly organization formed in the 1890s to forward the study of early American history. And our main thing we do is publish primary documents, and our next publication will be the papers of John Hancock, which curiously have never been published until now, and in time for July 4th of 2026, we hope. And we have also published the papers of Thomas Hutchinson, lest you think we are one-sided in our approach to history. And we also host programs like this one, where we invite a scholar to come and present his or her work. And our speaker this afternoon is Kirsten Wood, who is a professor of history at Florida International University. After receiving her undergraduate degree, summa cum laude, from Princeton, and then doing her graduate work at Penn, she set off for sunnier climes and has been teaching at the Florida International University in Miami for close to 3 decades. Her first book was Masterful Women, Slaveholding Widows from the American Revolution through the Civil War. And I love someone who writes titles that tell you what the book is about. It is about widows who owned slaves and their relationships, not only with one another, but with the people they enslaved. And about 10 years ago, she wrote a really exciting article in the American Historical Review, Join with Heart and Soul and Voice, Music, Harmony, and Politics in the Early American Republic, looking at music, singing in the early republic. She is a member of the American Historical Association, the Organization of American Historians, the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. She's a life member of the Southern Association for Women Historians, as well as the Southern Historical Association. And we're delighted that she will be telling us about her new book, Accommodating the Republic, Taverns in the Early United States. So please welcome Professor Kirsten Wood.
Thank you. Does this need to be up here? No, okay, great. Good afternoon. I'm really delighted to be here at the Colonial Society of Massachusetts to share some of my research. Newspapers, letters, and pamphlets from the early republic contain many attacks on taverns. For instance, in 1787, an essay in the Pennsylvania Gazette asserted that tavern goers would believe anything printed in the pages of lying, scandalous newspapers. Decades later, temperance advocates warned that tavern goers can be hurried into the violation of the laws and the destruction of property, peace, and life. These claims speak to a real concern that an alcoholic republic could not long survive. Drunken voters could be bribed or manipulated, leading to the fatal corruption of Republican institutions. Another concern we see intermittently was that tavern going might lead to insurrection, as had occurred in the Revolutionary era, after all, and again during the so-called Shays Rebellion, for example, of the mid-1780s. Decades of dire warnings about the evils of alcohol, reinforced by economic dislocations and religious revivals, nearly ended Americans' love affair with liquor in the early 19th century. This may be a little bit hard to see in this room because of the lighting, but what we see is a plummet in Americans' average per capita alcohol consumption in the mid-1830s. So we see a growth in alcohol consumption in the early 19th century, and then this precipitous drop from about the mid-1830s. Yet this decline in drinking did not spell the end of taverns. In fact, a new type of tavern emerged in this period, the temperance tavern. And again, let's see. Yeah, again, it's going to be difficult. Those of you on this side may wish you were on that side, and if you want to get up and move, be my guest. I have a lot of images to show, and you may just want to move over. Those of you watching on the Zoom may actually be in a better position today. I begin here with changes in alcohol consumption and with this advertisement for a temperance tavern in Salem, Massachusetts, because this conjunction speaks to the conviction and reality that in the early republic, successful taverns helped make towns and villages into commercial and leisure destinations for both locals and strangers. More broadly, my research shows that taverns became increasingly significant to economic innovation, geographic mobility, and expansion. And during the period from roughly 1780 to about 1860, taverns also remained key sites of political mobilization. And because of their importance to Americans' individual and collective pursuits of happiness, taverns became places to define and test the day-to-day boundaries of belonging in the new republic. As Americans contested who should use taverns and how, they established that taverns were not, in fact, the exclusive terrain of any subset of white men, nor of white men in general. By the 1840s and 1850s, the U.S. would become markedly more democratic for white men, especially in the northern states, thanks in no small part to partisan competition, print culture, and the spread of Republican norms and institutions, all of which affected taverns. But middle-class white women, usually seen as the enemies of tavern culture, and Black Americans, who are often the targets of tavern violence, also used taverns for their own purposes. Acting individually and together, white women and Black Americans also helped shift American political culture in more democratic directions, albeit with distinct and competing understandings of democracy. So tavern interactions thus fostered vernacular or everyday grassroots practices and understandings of citizenship. Now, this audience probably doesn't need me to define taverns, but just in case, it's important to know that at the beginning of the 19th century, states had passed or reaffirmed colonial licensing laws which authorized tavern keepers to sell alcohol by the drink as opposed to larger volumes like half gallons and gallons, and required them, in turn, to provide food and shelter to travelers and their horses or cattle. While often ignored or modified in coastal cities, the requirement existed to protect travelers. As keepers of public houses for the public, tavern keepers were also required to maintain public order. In a nutshell, this meant ensuring that legal customers didn't ruin themselves by drinking and gambling. It also meant that keepers were supposed to prevent their patrons from disturbing the neighborhood with noisy carousing, with violence, obvious prostitution, blasphemy, and Sunday drinking. Lastly, tavern keepers were responsible for monitoring minors, indentured servants, apprentices, soldiers, and sailors who could only drink in taverns if their legal superiors authorized it. Interestingly, women as such were not mentioned in tavern licensing laws. When statutes addressed women's presence in taverns, it was indirectly through laws governing, for example, servants or slaves or illicit sex. Tavern licensing laws also had little or nothing to say about tavern premises, except to stipulate a minimum number of beds for travelers, i.e. they couldn't be shared with tavern household members, and they also stipulated the number of the amount of stabling for horses. Accordingly, by the mid-19th century, a wide variety of taverns could be found in the United States. Some were very simple one-room log cabins in which cooking and eating and drinking and sleeping all took place in the same room. Unhappy travelers sometimes disparaged this sort of tavern as being worse than a, quote, dog kennel. The quotation on the slide says something similar at a greater length. And when genteel folk and ministers and public officials saw or had to visit this kind of tavern, they often assumed that their keepers were flatly crooks and their patrons necessarily disorderly drunks. But this kind of observer did not typically appreciate that in important ways, humble tavern goers resembled their rich contemporaries. Both rich and ordinary men visited taverns not only to drink and socialize, but also to share information, do business, and mobilize their literal or metaphorical capital. Now, at the opposite end of the spectrum of public accommodations from the log cabin tavern, we see places like this: elaborate, large, and increasingly extensive and expensive public accommodations. So-called first-class public accommodations could be urban or rural, but they typically served middle-class and wealthy patrons. Some had dozens or even hundreds of bedrooms, and they also featured specialized dining rooms, parlors, reading rooms, smoking rooms, newsrooms sometimes. First-class hotels sought to make themselves welcoming to families and female travelers, as suggested by the women in these two images. So, for example, there are women on the balcony at the Merchants Hotel, and then women all over the grounds in the front of the Marine Pavilion at Rockaway, Long Island. Unsurprisingly, most taverns fell somewhere between these architectural and social extremes, and with good reason. Most jurisdictions in the early Republic fixed the prices that tavern keepers could charge for their basic goods and services. As a result, it was not easy for tavern keepers to differentiate themselves by price unless local rate setters allowed them to. And so in the Baltimore case here, you can see that the tavern keeper could offer a hot dinner for a higher price than a cold dinner, hot supper versus cold supper, etc., and also offer first, second, or third quality Madeira wine for anybody who felt like paying as much for wine. Whiskey was relatively cheap at 3 pence per gill. A gill was 4 ounces. Lodgings, comparatively cheap at 9 pence per night. So in comparison to your hot dinner, your lodging was, comparatively speaking, significantly cheaper. This allows for some differentiation, but only a limited amount. The idea of differentiation was, there's a door left open, and I'll get back to this in a minute. The keepers sometimes manage to find ways to differentiate beyond what's actually specified on the price list, and as I say, I will get back to that in a minute. Now, local patrons of a typical rural wayside tavern, such as, for example, the Spread Eagle Tavern, which was about a day to the northwest of Philadelphia, would include small-scale farmers, craftsmen, agricultural laborers, and a handful of local grandees, more substantial landowners, lawyers, for example. Traveling patrons would encompass everyone from peddlers and wagoners and people traveling on foot, prosperous leisure travelers, lawyers, merchants, judges, government officials, and people coming on stagecoaches and in private carriages. Looking far to the south, we can see some similarities and differences. Isaac Fraser's advertisement for his tavern in Columbia, South Carolina, tells us that he did steady business with drovers, men who drove herds of horses, mules, and hogs from farms to urban markets. So he has space to accommodate these droves of livestock at his tavern. Fraser also had appropriate rooms, elegantly furnished, for gentlemen cotton planters and their families. By advertising both the amenities for drovers and the elegant, genteel accommodations, tavern keepers such as Isaac Fraser sought to appeal to wide audiences. And they also signaled that they were ready to accommodate not just well-heeled men, but families and women on the move. So even before the turn of the century, rural tavern keepers in certain areas began investing in amenities that appealed to people then known as gentlemen and ladies. And just as an aside, we've known for a long time that by the mid-18th century, or even earlier in some places, urban taverns are starting to specialize. We have certain urban taverns that are trying to appeal to a more, if you will, upscale kind of crowd. But finding it in rural areas is the part that I think has needed more attention than it's received in the past. So initially, this investment was most obvious in the form, for example, of private bedrooms and in separating dining rooms from bar rooms. Later on came a variety of tavern parlors. This took, again, several forms. Parlors shared by tavern families and their guests, parlors that any traveler could use, parlors specifically for female travelers, and private parlors that could be reserved for a family or an individual's use. Not covered in price lists, private parlors could be profitable if keepers attracted enough patrons willing and able to pay for them. Some of these improved taverns, as I call them, were purpose-built, but many tavern keepers updated their premises slowly over time, expanding 1 or 2 room taverns by adding wings or stories or entire new buildings. This image shows how a keeper of a Georgia stagecoach tavern wrapped a major expansion around an existing tavern built on a basic 2-room plan. This expansion allowed the keeper to begin offering multiple bedrooms, a separate dining room, and an extensive porch, which allowed, again, for more separation of the tavern family from the guests, as well as greater separation of the guests from each other and of different activities from each other as well. Such expansions were often speculative on the if you build it, they will come principle. And while keepers did not always make money in their trade, those who operated in a market town or a county seat had reason to hope they would recoup any investment they made in improvements, a period term I use to encompass both expansions and upgrades. Those who kept taverns along an established or proposed stagecoach line often had reason to improve too, as in the case of the Georgia Man, as the links between taverns and commercial transportation were many in the early republic. And here we have three newspaper illustrations marking the point. Keepers were crucial partners for stagecoach lines, which expand enormously in the early 19th century as road building grows also. Sometimes keepers are also investors or co-partners in stagecoach lines. The Salem and Haverhill ad shows how stagecoach lines use taverns as stops along the way where their passengers could be refreshed with meals and also their horses and changed as well. And taverns are also serving as a kind of ticketing facility for stagecoach companies. The keeper of the Indian Queen Tavern, the image on the right hand of the slide, knew that he could attract customers simply by providing an up-to-date book of stagecoach routes and schedules. And the Boston and Providence line on the bottom right stopped at taverns, kept their books at other taverns, and advertised their ability to intersect with the New York steamboats. So we see a lot of stagecoach companies advertising that this line intersects with other lines and also intersects with other modes of transportation, both steamboats and railroads. And in fact, in their early years, new railroads also made use of taverns, sometimes as passenger depots, saving money on those kind of capital investments, and also as watering stations. This is a short period in railroad history, but an important one in the critical early years when it's not entirely clear from the get-go that the railroads that are so successful for passenger transportation in Great Britain will translate to the much bigger geographies of the US. So taverns are an important constituent part of the new nation's rapidly changing infrastructure through and beyond mid-century, part of that transportation revolution. So the interdependence between transportation and taverns mean that taverns remain great places to get information. What happened there? There we go. Okay. So this painting shows the mail carrier coming in here, carrying a bag of mail and newspapers, and being greeted by people who are perhaps in the tavern specifically to wait for the mail coach's arrival. It also shows newspapers hanging on the walls for customers to use, a newspaper being read over there, and then a writing desk in the corner, all of which speaks to the ways that taverns were places that face-to-face exchanges of information and information gathering through print culture intersect. Krimmel's painting also illustrates how taverns assembled people from different walks of life. In this painting, we see not just this sort of interesting family group in the center, but we see younger men and older men, and we see people whose attire suggests that they're in different walks of life by occupation and perhaps more clearly by socioeconomic status. So mixing with strangers, locals you didn't know already, and strangers coming through in a stagecoach, for example, was a way to gather diverse information. But this was not always easy to accomplish. It was not always even safe. A tavern visitor might be looking, for instance, about information about the quality and price of local lands or prices in distant markets, but hear nothing but the election, the election. As a young man, Roberts Vaux of Philadelphia observed that at this time, every man is up to his armpits in politics. Visiting Charleston around the same time, a Briton noted that if a man did not want to risk his life at 10 paces, he should hold his tongue, as nothing is more common than an appeal to pistols. Even in New England, a couple decades later, when middle-class masculinity strongly devalued violence, young or brash travelers could still get into difficulties. New York City's Abram Hewitt and his friend Edward Cooper, and yes, it's Cooper Hewitt, those those two individuals, in fact. They learned this firsthand during a 21st birthday tour through New England. We don't know whether it was their, city slang, their youthful manners, or their fashionable clothing that annoyed the rural regulars at a tavern near Dover, New Hampshire. Perhaps it was all three. In any case, Hewitt described later that the villainous-looking keeper of this tavern seemed as likely to knock us down as pick his teeth. One of the patrons, who combined the characteristics of the bulldog and the cutthroat, grabbed the young men's walking sticks and commenced a sweeping invective against aristocrats. Afraid of being identified as one of these aristocrats and perhaps clubbed down with their own sticks, Hewitt launched into a general eulogy on laborers and Democrats to appease this ferocious gentleman. In his journal the next day, Hewitt's making light of the situation, but you can kind of see how this had been a scary moment for the two youngsters from New York. The journals of another New Yorker, Sarah Howland, suggest more pleasant travels, but they raise questions in their own turn. Sarah journaled her way through family trips to Philadelphia, to Connecticut, to Rhode Island, up the Hudson Valley, and to Niagara Falls. During each trip, she described their route and rated the taverns they visited. Brewster's Inn, a very good house. Coulter's Hotel, a poor place. Ackerley's, a most miserable place. As the wife of a prosperous New York man of business, Sarah Howland took for granted that she could both patronize and judge taverns. But she recorded almost no details of what she actually saw, and she wrote as if she and her family were the only guests in every place they visited. On a busy route in the summer, however, she could not have avoided members of the tavern household or other patrons, because some of these taverns were undoubtedly small and lacked separate parlors, dining rooms, and bar rooms. Several likely had porches of the type suggested by my book's cover image. Made in a variety of styles depending on the vernacular architecture of the region, porches were a common feature in early 19th century American taverns, and the ways that men typically used them created an uncomfortable environment for any woman to move through. Unlike the verandas of the so-called first-class hotels, shown up here at Congress Hall in Saratoga Springs, which you can see are clearly a mixed-sex space for genteel socializing, the typical tavern porch is a masculine space. Men occupied porches with casual postures. They filled it with tobacco smoke, often, and foul language, for example. Taverns that offered private bedrooms and parlors made it easier for women travelers to limit their exposure to such behaviors, but you still had to cross the gauntlet of the porch to get there. Welcoming respectable women through these features created moments when competing tavern behaviors clashed on the porch or in the dining room or on the way, again, to these more segregated spaces. At the same time, these taverns, these improved taverns as I call them, created valuable opportunities for two subsets of white men. Those who could easily move back and forth between genteel and rowdy masculinity, who could hang out in the bar and then move to the parlor, for example, and those who chose women's company and feminized spaces precisely to avoid their hard-drinking, gambling, and politicking brothers, for example, on the porch or in the bar. Now, if we widen our lens to consider the possibility of black Americans' presence, and you'll see that there's one black man figured in Koellner's print, we add yet another dimension to our thinking about the relationship between taverns, travel, and everyday citizenship. It must be said that taverns were, in the main, terribly grim spaces for black Americans, especially the enslaved. Throughout the South, and not just the South, but primarily the South, enslaved people were forced to labor in taverns and suffered many forms of public and private violence, including emotional abuse, sale, rape, mutilation, and even death. Very occasionally, however, enslaved people managed to use tavern spaces and cultures to their own ends, illustrating how access to taverns represented both an index of and a means to freedom. Consider young Jermaine Logan, who, with a friend, fled from a plantation south of Nashville in the late 1830s. Unusually, the young men escaped with horses and money, and their plan was to pose as free people of color. At least twice before they left Ohio and left the South, and crossed the Ohio River, they stopped at taverns, a bold move that required them to make convincing performances of freedom. In both taverns, the barrooms were, as Logan described later, literally filled with white men in all stages of intoxication. At all costs, these enslaved young men needed to avoid any confrontation with the drunken white men, so they asked for and received the use of private parlors. While the bellowing of the crazy and drunken men kept them awake all night, their seclusion, a product of genteel culture and tavern improvements, kept them safe. Now, I want to pivot back to local patrons of taverns, who were in the majority in most taverns. What did taverns mean to them? Unsurprisingly, most taverns were not temperance taverns, and keepers' account books show extensive liquor sales, both before and after that decline in drinking rates that I showed in that chart from the 1830s. Take the case of Martin Brown, a tavern keeper in Northern Virginia. In 1803, 1804, for instance, nearly 90% of his tavern sales involved alcohol. He sold almost no lodgings or meals or horse feed, but his tavern still played a significant role in the local economy because in addition to liquor, he conducted a diverse trade in locally produced foodstuffs and in manufactured goods. And for everything from whiskey to woolens, Brown extended credit and accepted payment in kind, in labor, in promissory notes, and in cash, which helped keep household economies functioning and credit circulating throughout his neighborhood. So it's not just a place that people wasted money and got drunk. But taverns did not become important community institutions just by doubling as stores. Some taverns also nurtured a much wider range of entrepreneurial and collective activities. Tavern settings helped spread the word about the value or risk of local ventures, for example, as people came and went to drink, socialize, supply their households, read newspapers, and conduct other business. They also learned of and exchanged opinions about turnpike plans, for example, proposals for a new textile manufactory, and newly patented machines on display. In each case, people hoping to win support for their investment, their invention, or their cause sought to leverage pre-existing networks of friendship, obligation, and interest. They often relied explicitly on tavern keepers in this regard, not only using tavern space to do business, but counting on keepers to pass messages, handle money, and take names on their behalf. As an example of a tavern that was many things to many people, consider the Golden Ball Tavern in Haverhill, Massachusetts. In the mid-1820s, the Golden Ball was a stage tavern, so it welcomed a steady stream of strangers. The Golden Ball also held a variety of meetings, such as shareholders' meetings of the Chester Turnpike Corporation. And some of the people who came to the Golden Ball as investors doubtless came back to do their civic duty, whether as citizens or as caucus members in advance of the 1824 election. And some of these men came back again, probably with wives and children, to enjoy the Golden Ball's facilities as a performance space. The acclaimed ventriloquist Richard Potter staged one of his performances there in 1824. And Richard Potter is someone who has been described variously as black or mulatto or racially ambiguous, but he toured extensively in New England and even the Mid-Atlantic and the South in the 1810s and 1820s. And so he's, again, one of the people who performs in the Golden Ball in this period. These examples suggest how tavern going formed part of pursuing economic and social and political and cultural opportunities. They also illustrate why arguments that taverns were a blight on the Republic were slow to get real traction. People across the social spectrum patronized them for both everyday and special occasions. So now I want to pivot back to politics. I started this talk by referencing some unfavorable political opinions about taverns, and I want to return to those concerns. As I alluded to at the outset, in the mid-1780s and afterwards, a series of violent uprisings in Massachusetts and beyond appeared to threaten public order. In several of them, taverns and tavern keepers played important roles, providing not just liquid courage, but also leadership, networks, and places to organize collective resistance, much as they had done in the Revolutionary era. Demobilized veterans picked up their Revolutionary War weapons and their political mobilizing skills to protest what was going on in their state legislatures, for example. But with the Constitution's ratification, many of the more conservative founders believed that the tactics of mass political mobilization could be consigned to the past. In the new republic, the electorate had delegated specific powers to their representatives, and that delegation meant that the voters' role was to elect their representatives, and if unsatisfied with them, replace them at the next election. And basically, that was it. In this conservative vision, at least. In practice, however, even before the politics of George Washington's first administration aroused opposition outside as well as within Congress, ordinary tradesmen, artisans, and farmers, as well as wealthy and well-educated men, started gathering in taverns to discuss local and state and national issues and figured out who they wanted to support. And while George Washington famously deplored the so-called self-created societies that criticized his administration, by the end of the 1790s, both the Washington and Adams-affiliated Federalists and their emerging Jeffersonian Republican opponents regularly held tavern meetings to prepare for elections. At these meetings, ordinary, self-organized, if you will, voters practiced what were increasingly understood as everyday political skills in a republic: deliberating upon men and measures, crafting resolutions to appeal to a wider public, forming committees to accomplish specific tasks, and building strategies and processes to maintain their momentum. And that might sound kind of dull. It leads to some pretty repetitive advertisements in newspapers, but it's a part of a really important set of skills that leads to what historians and political scientists call political efficacy. And politics in taverns was not merely partisan, as the electoral examples suggest, it was also governmental. In dozens of new counties and hundreds of new towns and villages being created across the United States, judges and sheriffs and other state, town, and county officials used taverns as courtrooms, as jails, and meeting rooms. And this role was not confined to new communities on the edges of white settlement either. New towns being created in long-existing counties also used taverns in this way from time to time. And well into the 19th century, state legislatures and local election officials designate taverns as polling places in both urban and rural electoral districts. This choice has the effect of linking voting with drinking, which a growing chorus of voices deems unacceptable, but it also links tavern going with that most visible and widespread act of political belonging in the early republic. So it's not just pre-election meetings in taverns, it's also sometimes going to taverns actually to cast your vote. And while voting was indeed mostly reserved for white men, in places where black men could vote in any numbers, they too engage in pre-election tavern meetings, as we can see in these New York City newspaper clips. So black Federalists were meeting at a few different lower Manhattan taverns, for example, to discuss elections and Thomas Jefferson's policies in 1808 and 1809. So they meet to nominate their candidates, perhaps to affirm candidates elected in other meetings, but also to condemn Thomas Jefferson's trade embargo against Great Britain, which they attributed to, and I do love this phrase, executive imbecility and foreign influence. In the 1820s, village and town taverns became critical organizing spaces in what turned out to be a critical decade of realignment. In 1824, voters held meetings. This is the one. Where was I before? Oh, that was the elections. This is where we're seeing taverns being used as polling places. This is the one with the black Federalists in New York, sorry. And then here we are, 1824. So this is the Golden Ball caucus meeting is actually listed right with several other meetings, political meetings of different types around the same time in Massachusetts. And the interesting thing here is that you can see that there are different kinds of meetings being held. Some are merely informational, some are to nominate candidates, and some are explicitly partisan already. Because of meetings like these in taverns and other venues in villages, towns, and cities across the nation, by the time Andrew Jackson got elected to the presidency in 1828, his supporters had reason to believe that they had helped make the democracy from the bottom up, even though historians have said for a long time we really need to pay attention to the role of certain, shall we say, president makers who are leading state parties. But from the point of view of the ordinary voters, their habits of meeting in tavern meetings made them co-makers of this so-called democracy. But it's worth remembering that tavern meetings were not exclusive to Jackson men. John Quincy Adams's National Republican supporters had also participated in many tavern meetings, forming committees and sending delegates to their own conventions, some of which are reflected in the Baltimore advertisement from 1828 at the bottom right of the slide. Also important in shaping the political culture of the 1820s and after was the growing reality that, as Alexis de Tocqueville famously noted, Americans of all ages, all conditions, and all dispositions constantly form associations. As I mentioned before, Americans work together, for example, to build turnpike roads and also to promote manufacturing. Both women and men formed and joined associations to promote education, to support poor relief, and to promote some radical causes such as temperance and anti-slavery. Many of these associations drafted constitutions, drafted resolutions, elected officers, and had regular meetings, whether at the local, state, or national level. They're doing the same kind of basic political work that people are doing in advance of elections. And a surprising variety of them met in taverns. Although doctors were among the loudest voices condemning excessive drinking, some of the early New England medical societies held their meetings in taverns with dinners with alcohol. The occasional temperance society met in taverns. We might speculate that those must have been temperance taverns, but it happens in places where they're clearly not temperance taverns yet. So it's rare, but it does happen. And that's not my discovery. A historian, Lee Willis, looking at Florida, discovered a women's temperance society who met in a tavern. Very, very anomalous, but also delightful. Missionary societies collected at least a little bit of money by leaving collecting boxes in taverns. And so here we have just a couple examples of collecting boxes. C boxes, collecting box, left in Shriver's Tavern or in Bouse Tavern in Maryland. And again, temperance makes some advances in the South. We, for a long time, thought that the South was clearly going to be totally hostile to temperance. In fact, it made some inroads. And again, you can see that in this sort of apparently anomalous, but not quite as strange as all that, presence of collecting boxes in taverns. Okay. The most radical of associations, as I would call them in the period, the anti-slavery or abolition societies, usually convened in other spaces, in churches, in town halls, but even they sometimes met in taverns, sometimes because churches were close to them. Abolitionists also patronized taverns and hotels during their lecture tours, but they faced unusually high risks of verbal abuse or even physical violence, whether their meetings were in town halls or taverns or churches or anywhere else. At its worst in the late 1830s, anti-abolition violence extended to murder, riot, and arson that especially targeted black individuals and communities. In the 1840s and 1850s, this open violence was less common, but even in the temperance hotels and taverns that welcomed white abolitionists, black abolitionists in particular received distinctly second-class hospitality. And this becomes a subject in print culture, which I think is, its explicitness is really important. For example, at Boston's Marlborough Hotel, known for its temperance platform and its friendliness to anti-slavery patrons, black performer Mary E. Webb could get a room, but she was barred from both the dining room and the on-site religious services. As Frederick Douglass put it, the management refused to treat her as a woman and a sister, in the common abolitionist phrase. What I want you to notice here is that the news of Mary Webb's ill treatment made it into an Ohio anti-slavery newspaper, which mentioned by name both the hotel which treated her badly and another one which welcomed her. Black abolitionist publishers seized every opportunity to name and shame taverns and hotels who mistreated black travelers. and instructed their readers to patronize other establishments, such as the American Hotel and Durham House in Cleveland, Ohio, which treated black travelers with the respect and attention commonly paid to other travelers. Importantly, the occasions which brought black men and women to hotels and taverns at mid-century, meanwhile, were often overtly political. They were giving anti-slavery lectures and attending abolition conventions. In the 1850s, in short, access to public accommodations remained an important index of and means to citizenship. In 1855, Alabama attorney Charles P. Robinson made the point in a lawsuit about tavern keepers' liability for lost property. In the United States, he argued, a common knowledge, common ideas, common laws, the habit of traveling, equal knowledge, and an active intelligence have clothed the traveler with a citizenship wherever his journey leads him. Robinson was correct about travel's significance, but incorrect in suggesting that all travelers were equally clothed with citizenship. Just a few years before, Southerners in Congress had forced many Northerners to reassess their position in the Republic. The 1850 Fugitive Slave Act told white Northerners they could be forced to assist federal marshals in capturing alleged fugitives and rendering them to bondage. And it reminded black Northerners that the right to due process didn't apply to them, because judges were paid $10 if they consigned a supposed fugitive to slavery, and only $5 for restoring them to freedom, while anyone accused of being a fugitive was barred from testifying in their own defense. As at any historical inflection point, resistance to the fugitive slave crisis took many forms. Some African Americans migrated to Canada or Great Britain or Haiti. White and black abolitionists protested vehemently in print. Some people who had not even been abolitionists before joined in forcibly resisting efforts to render people to slavery under the act. Some black men formed militias, preparing to defend themselves and their neighbors. Eventually, a new political party, the Republican Party, would form, forged out of the certainty that the slave power was strangling Northerners' freedom of speech, movement, and assembly, their political choices, and their economic prospects. In the US of 2026, we have no direct analogy to early 19th century taverns. No single institution, public or private, combines all the functions that were once common to thriving town and village taverns. Alongside our motels and hotels, we have a variety of commercial institutions that serve a limited set of public functions, such as convention centers and shopping malls. We also have nonprofit spaces, such as this one, museums, community centers, and public libraries, in some places very beleaguered. And as very recent events have reminded us, other spaces also matter for our sense of the public. Parks, sidewalks, work sites, bridges, the fronts of public buildings, and even carpool lanes can become spaces to assert or abridge the American people's right to self-government. But one continuity is that today, as in 1800, whether we can safely and easily access public accommodations and other public spaces both reflects and shapes our personal freedoms, our economic horizons, and our political efficacy. Thank you. I hope there'll be some questions.
Well, just a minor question and a comment. First, back to the chart on the cost of the tavern and the meals. I just want to know what the difference was between between a hot dinner and a hot supper.
Dinner is lunch and supper is dinner.
All right.
But the food probably is the same, because if you look at the prices, actually the hot supper oddly is cheaper, and that's unusual. Most of the price lists that I've seen have dinner and supper as the same, and the breakfast is usually cheaper. It's a little anomaly, so I don't know about that one. Sometimes, dinner is the main meal of the day, typically, so it may be that there's less variety in the supper imagined in this case.
Okay. And then just my general comment, because I'm fascinated now. So for 7 years, I was the history director for the Haverhill Public Schools.
Oh, okay.
And it's not, and now it's not lost on me that I went to a number of meetings and even political events at the taverns in Haverhill, especially along Washington Street.
Oh, cool.
Because now I'm going to have to try to figure out if some of these places are actually still in existence.
Oh, that would be great.
Or what the comp, what the comp is. I think especially the Golden Hotel.
Golden Ball.
Yeah, the Golden Ball. Yeah, because knowing the Hillies, it's probably still there.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these buildings survive, but were taverns only for a while, then become private homes or something else.
In the colonial period, selectmen or other local government authorities generally kept fairly tight control through licensing laws. Did those sorts of regulations wither away in the early republic?
That's a really good question, and I'm going to have to resort to one of my favorite answers. I have two answers when my grad students ask me questions. It depends, or it's complicated, and both apply in this case, because it's so dependent on location, right? Some places don't even have selectmen. So the amount of local, I'll call it police authority, but I'm meaning that term very loosely, varies extensively. And so some places do not have anything that's quite equivalent to selectmen to do that kind of policing work. But in general, there's always somebody who's supposed to be responsible for ensuring that tavern keepers do what they're supposed to. But there's sort of two points at which this is supposed to happen. One is in the licensing process, as you suggest, and one is in the monitoring after the license is granted. And so every place that I've ever looked at has this elaborate set of requirements. You have to prove that you're a fit and proper person to get the license in the first place, and the definitions of fit and proper are generally consistent. The language varies a little bit. You have to have often support from your neighbors, so your petition to get a license may have to be backed with signatures from many of your neighbors. There's a cluster of surviving petitions for licenses from New Jersey that have these lists of names, and one of the things that's interesting about that is that the same names recur across multiple petitions, suggesting that there's some sort of familial and social and perhaps economic interest in having these particular taverns be authorized. I wouldn't necessarily say that that's about we love to drink. I think there are other issues going on there. And then, of course, there's the licensing fee, which is one thing, but then more to the point is the securities you have to provide. You have to put down a bond to secure your good behavior, and then other people have to stand security for you as well. So you need one or two people to do that. And all of that means there's a fair amount of money on the line to secure your good conduct, but all that's fine and large. But if no one's checking, your risk is significantly less. So sometimes it's a sheriff, sometimes it's a local tattletale, and then reports to the sheriff. Richard Potter, who I mentioned as the entertainer, he gets into trouble in a Rhode Island town whose name is slipping my mind right now. But he gets in trouble because there's been a law recently passed as he's touring around that doesn't allow certain kinds of performances, and somebody reports him because the person who reports him gets half of the huge fine. It's like hundreds of dollars in fine. And it turns out that the person who reports him to the local authority is kin to the local authority. So basically, it's like, we're going to split this hefty fine if we get this guy. Whether there's also a sort of racial animus to it, too, what one might imagine. Interestingly, the tavern keeper is also liable under that law, but he doesn't get charged. So there's all kinds of shenanigans that can happen. So certain tavern keepers are insulated by their local prominence, defined either socially, economically, politically, or all of the above. So some people, again, get surprised, policed more than others. All of which is to say that there's a gap between what the law says and what the law does, and there's a lot more enforcement in some places than others. It also has to do with population density. It's much harder to police the more sparsely settled South, except that there's a particular concern around the taverns that might be, the tavern keepers who might be trafficking illicitly with enslaved people, providing them with whiskey. And in some places that's tolerated because the great planters in the area think that's okay as long as it's kept within certain bounds. Other places the slave patrol comes down on that like 100 of bricks. So this is when I say it depends and it's complicated. I could keep talking for another half an hour, but do you want to follow up with a follow-up question on that? No? Okay.
Two quick questions. First, do you own more than one tavern? And secondly, the Association of Liquor and Food.
Mm-hmm.
I believe here in Massachusetts, you cannot have a liquor license to serve liquor by the drink unless you also serve food. Has that always been the case?
Well, I don't want to speak to always in terms of periods that I don't actually look at, so I'm not going to do that. But in the period that I look at, yes. But the real point that gets interesting is the food and shelter, because it's typically liquor by the drink in exchange for food and shelter for humans and livestock. And it's those multiple things you have to have. And what starts to happen is that, for example, in Massachusetts, the laws that are passed or reaffirmed after the Revolution create an exception. So, and you have to read the statute carefully to see what they mean. The statute still requires, in exchange for the license to sell by the drink, food and shelter for humans and shelter for animals and food for animals. But if you're in a city, you don't need to provide pasturage, which makes sense. Pastures in the city just don't make any sense. And lots of municipalities start to do this. They start to waive the stabling requirements, like Michigan does this, waiving stabling requirements. New York's mayor and aldermen, around the turn of the century are complaining that there was a change in the state law which made it possible for New York not to have lodgings. Now I can't remember if it's lodging or stabling also. And then the number of taverns goes through the roof, and then they complain, and so Mayor Verica says, we can't put up with this. We have to go back to the old regulations because there's just too many taverns. There's like a tavern every other block, and there are too many taverns per capita. So it's less the idea of food and more the idea of shelter or accommodations, again, for livestock. But as time moves on, so somewhat more out of my period, the connection of liquor and food is going to be important because they've given up on shelter, because boarding houses are becoming more important, for example. And they've given up on the transportation piece because commercial transportation is becoming more separated from taverns. People aren't traveling with their own livestock. They're traveling on somebody else's horse, somebody else's horsepower, somebody else's steam power. And so those things get separated slowly. So by the second half of the 19th century, I would imagine, but don't know from my own research, that's where the liquor and food in particular becomes important. But earlier on, it's food and shelter and stabling. Make sense? Oh, yes, sorry, that one. I've never seen that being discussed, to be honest. And so it's really the question of like owning a tavern is not the same thing as having a license. So the premises are often owned by somebody who doesn't have the license, because running a tavern and owning the property, again, they don't have to be the same thing. So many people rent the property and get the license. But oops, that's not mine. This is it, what I'm looking for. Where'd it go? This case here, the Salem Gazette advertisement where someone is urging a temperance tavern to come to Salem. If you could read it, it's, again, a bit small. The idea is that this person who has just bought this property, who already has a coffee house, should run it as a temperance tavern. And depending on what the exact state of the law is in this particular moment, the temperance tavern may well still need a license of some kind, so that person might end up having 2 licensed premises. So that's a good question, and it would, again, potentially vary state by state. It would be unlikely for somebody who wasn't, again, a particularly well-respected and well-funded person to be able to get 2 licenses. That's the best I can do.
Hi,
Hey.
thank you. That's a good segue into my question, actually. Because
Okay.
I'm really interested in the temperance taverns,
Mhm.
partly because I haven't heard much about them at all before. I'm curious because it seems like in taverns, the alcohol was such a big source of both function and income for them. Did temperance taverns, is there evidence that they were successful in maintaining all of the other functions of a tavern? In terms of social, place to meet, place to write letters and paper communications, is there evidence that they were as successful, or is it something that a few existed and then it kind of tapered off? I'm curious about that.
That's a good question. So I have not found any, account books for temperance taverns. And even when you find account books, it's difficult to tell whether a tavern is successful. One of the things that I found really frustrating in doing this work is that figuring out the economics of taverns is hard, because what you find, you might find accounts that show what customers are doing, but you never find the bills side. You never find what tavern keepers are paying for their goods, or what they're paying for their capital improvements or anything. So you never get the sense of the costs. So you may get their gross theoretical profits, but you can never even tell necessarily whether they actually collect, because they're selling on credit so much of the time. So the financial picture is a disaster trying to figure that out, typically. And then you may figure out, okay, well, that person went out of business, so probably they weren't making a go of it. So you might think that running a tavern is a money spinner because of the alcohol trade, but it's not even so clear as that. So that's one thing. On the temperance taverns front, because we start seeing in the 1840s and 1850s more and more anti-alcohol laws actually being passed, the sort of temperance tavern as a specific niche that's running parallel to wet taverns, that's a relatively short-lived phenomenon. So in the longer run, you might say that they're not successful, but there is evidence of a sort in the newspaper advertisements where you can see similar kinds of activities being advertised in so-and-so's temperance tavern. So, for example, the Whigs, not in 1840, the cider election, but afterwards, they're advertising in, I think I saw it in New Hampshire, advertising some of their activities in temperance taverns when they really start to embrace temperance activity. And so there's some of that there, but I think that might need to be its own separate study.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm curious for the discussion about just liquor, spirits, and on the list of rates, looking at wine as well.
Mm-hmm.
Where does beer and hard cider fit into that? Is there a distinction between these different things? Is beer seen more as food, or how is that?
Where are we? Let's see, I forget. Where did I put that? Oh, that's further down. There we go. Okay. Beer is rare until later into the 19th century. So you just don't find it. You might find, is it on this one? You find small beer, which is different. You find imported porter, like London porter, which is imported in bottles. But sort of lager beer is later. That's a German thing. And small beer is like, are you even drinking? You get that at home. You make that at home. It's not. It doesn't typically appear. Well, no, I take it back. It appears on some price lists. It doesn't appear on all of them. Finding price lists is harder. I mean, like rate lists like this is harder than you might think, which is really annoying. And you just don't find it on that many account books. So I looked at, close to a dozen account books, or a dozen different taverns account books with different kinds of records over time. And there's very little beer. I didn't do anything coming out of Ohio, coming out of areas with particularly German immigration later into the 19th century. But there's still very little beer. There's more cider, and it depends on where you are. There's more cider moving into the 19th century, so some people are moving away from spirits and still drinking cider. But, of the people who say that it's whiskey, 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 are not entirely wrong, but you do see surprising amounts of brandy, which may be fruit brandy. Sometimes it's like locally made fruit brandy. More rarely, you see something that claims to be imported. Although one of the things I found in the research, which I thought was quite amusing, was a recipe book to how to make fake claret and fake Madeira and fake whatever. That was pretty amusing. So you figure that probably the things that are being sold are often not what they claim to be. But the spirits will be safer.
My question was basically along those lines because the Temperance Tavern was offering beer. And just sort of answer that question.
Yeah. So temperance in the sort of early years of the 19th century often means I'm not going to drink spirits, like distilled liquors. So I might still drink small beer in various forms, and wine. And then later it becomes sort of teetotaling abstinence, and then that's a different thing. But yeah, you see that kind of temperance taverns being advertised as well, and some of the medical societies that are visiting taverns or coffee houses that are still clearly taverns because of what they're selling. They're advertising that we don't sell liquor, but we sell claret and champagne and muscadet and all this sort of stuff. Again, what it actually is, who knows, but that's what they're advertising themselves as. And not advertising their coffee, actually, even though it's a coffee house.
We have one more question before we open our own tavern.
Yes. Was there an economic incentive to have taverns besides like accommodations? But in other words, was there a tax incentive? What did the government receive by issuing a license? What's in it for the government?
Well, there's the direct fee, and you can see in accounts that are published in newspapers, but also would be in state records as well. Occasionally, the list of monies the state is collecting, and tavern fees often appear as a separate line. And it's not a huge money spinner, but it's there. It's significant, and so it's one of the things that they think are worth collecting. So there's this potentially perverse incentive to over-license for the sake of those fees, and that's one of the debates that happens. It's happening in colonial Boston. It's happening in the 19th century as well, about this idea that we want to get these fees, and so we're going to authorize more taverns than we actually need. The indirect argument about the sort of economic utility of taverns is one that is, maybe certain kinds of economic techniques might be used to try to prove it, but the idea that taverns are conducive to economic growth and development is one that's being made early on. So, and it's not so much about the state's benefit, but it's about the how would you put it? A vision of future prosperity. So let me give you an example. A lot of people are involved, as we know, in land speculation in the late 18th century, early 19th century. Some of the things that I was tracking were tavern meetings in Boston of people who were early speculators in the Ohio Company. And the people who are thinking about how to develop these big tracts, how to promote these big tracts, how to make the value of those land holdings, the prices that you could charge for the land go up over time. My vocabulary is failing me right now. What's the word? Appreciate. Are getting advice about the kinds of things you need to do. You need to do some basic investments in these places. You need to build some mills, and you need to plant some taverns. And those are the two things that one of the surveyor types who's hired by one of these land companies says. Taverns and mills are the two things you need. There's another example. Morris Birkbeck, who's the Englishman who goes and sort of creates this community out in, somebody help me, is it Indiana? I think it's Indiana. And one of his associates is talking about sort of starting a community. And one of the things he says is, as soon as the first tavern is created, there is Albion, the town. It actually exists now that we have a tavern. So there's this vision that one of the things you need for economic opportunity to start, or for people to see it, and for people to think about this being a place that I want to invest in, and that the land values will start to rise, is a tavern. So it's seen as a key economic institution, and to think of it as being as important as a mill, whether or not that's true, that's just a fascinating counter to the place where I started. We're saying taverns are for wastrels, taverns are for losers, taverns are going to destroy the republic. It's such a different vision, and they exist in competition at the same time. So that's an argument for an indirect benefit. But one of the things that I also try to argue, and again, sort of proving it is complicated, but this idea that the tavern networks, I was alluding to it earlier, are a way to deal with the free rider problem. So why am I going to invest my hard-earned money in this improvement, this bridge, this turnpike, whatever it is? Because I can just sit back, let you all invest in it, and the value of my land will start to go up anyway once the improvement has happened. And I get the indirect benefit without any cost. But the social pressure that exists through these tavern networks is potentially a way to deal with some of that free rider problem. That's not something that is necessarily a state imperative, but the people who are developmentally minded, if they're the ones who are thinking about state imperatives, could see an alignment there. That was really long-winded, but I hope it gave you something to think with.
All right.